are out of prison. And now that we have a vehicle to keep a person in prison for the balance of their lives, it just changes the equation. At one time had more people on death row than any other county in Texas. Time that a person goes to trial until that person is finally executed, there are a number of safeguards in the system.
That's how her day has gone so far. She has had an opportunity to make some phone calls if she wants to some other people, and so she's had a chance to visit with relatives, spiritual advisor, attorneys today.
We will never forget the members of the law enforcement who found Bobby Joe's murder in less than 24 hours.
The crime is so vile, so shocking, and it was premeditated.
She's had a chance to visit with relatives, spiritual advisor, attorneys today.
Victoria Joe is very beautiful, looks a lot like her mother.
And returned Victoria Joe safely to us. And loving wife, daughter, and sister, and would have been a wonderful mother.
Number 5, Kelly Gissendaner. Kelly Renee Gissendaner was a convicted slayer who became the first woman to be fatally punished in Georgia, United States in 70 years. Gissendaner was convicted of the slaying of her husband, Douglas Gissendaner, and sentenced to her end in 1998. She spent almost 2 decades on the row before her punishment. The last 24 hours of Kelly Gissendaner's life were marked by intense emotions, both for Gissendaner herself and for those who supported her. Gissendaner spent her final hours in a holding cell at the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison in Jackson, Georgia, awaiting her punishment. During this time, Gissendaner was visited by a number of family members and supporters, including her 3 children, her mother, and her spiritual advisor. Gissendaner's children were granted special permission to visit her in prison, while her mother and spiritual advisor spoke with her over the phone. According to reports, Gissendaner spent much of her final hours in prayer and reflection. She reportedly spoke with her children about her hopes and dreams for their future and encouraged them to continue to pursue their education and to make a positive impact in the world. Gissendaner's spiritual advisor, Reverend Kathy Zappa, described Gissendaner as being in a peaceful place during their final conversation. Zappa said that Gissendaner was focused on the message of forgiveness and that she expressed deep regret for the pain and suffering that she had caused others. In the hours leading up to her punishment, Gissendaner's legal team continued to pursue a last-ditch effort to have her sentence commuted. They filed an appeal with the Georgia Supreme Court, arguing that her sentence was unconstitutional given that she had not actually carried out the slaying. Despite these efforts, Gissendaner's punishment went ahead as scheduled. She was pronounced deceased at 12:21 a.m. on September 30, 2015, after receiving a lethal injection of pentobarbital. Number 4, Suzanne Margaret Basso. Suzanne Margaret Basso was a convicted criminal who was fatally punished by lethal injection in the state of Texas in 2014. Basso was sentenced for her role in the slaying of a mentally disabled man named Louis Buddy Musso. The slaying took place in 1998, when Basso and several accomplices lured Musso from New Jersey to Texas with the promise of marriage. Once he arrived, they subjected him to months of physical and emotional abuse, including beatings, whippings, and forced labor. In August of 1998, Musso perished from injuries sustained during one of these beatings. Basso and her accomplices then tried to cover up the crime by burying Musso's body in a shallow grave and posing as his relatives to collect his Social Security benefits. Basso was eventually arrested and charged with slaying, along with several other individuals who were involved in the crime. She was convicted in 1999 and sentenced. Although some people criticized the capital punishment, many said that Basso's crime was particularly heinous and that the punishment was appropriate given the severity of the offense. They noted that the case had been thoroughly reviewed by multiple courts and that Basso had been given numerous opportunities to appeal her sentence. Basso spent her final days and hours on the row at the Mountain View Unit Prison in Gatesville, Texas. She was destroyed by lethal injection on February 5, 2014, after spending more than 14 years on the row. She was pronounced deceased by lethal injection at 6:26 p.m. Number 3, Kimberly McCarthy. Texas marked a solemn moment in criminal justice on June 26, 2013, fatally punishing its 500th inmate since it resumed carrying out capital punishment in 1982. Kimberly McCarthy, who was put to her demise for the slaying of her 71-year-old neighbor, was also the first woman fatally punished in the U.S. in nearly 3 years at that time. McCarthy, 52, was executed for the 1997 robbery, beating, and fatal knifing of retired college psychology professor Dorothy Booth. Booth had agreed to give McCarthy a cup of sugar before she was after her with a butcher knife and candelabra at her home in Lancaster. Authorities say McCarthy cut off Booth's finger to remove her wedding ring. It was among 3 slayings linked to McCarthy, a former nursing home therapist who became addicted to crack cocaine. McCarthy's final federal appeal was denied in July 2012. Her attorneys filed a petition against the United States Supreme Court, and it was denied in January 2013. Her punishment date was initially set for January 29, 2013. Only hours before her lethal injection was scheduled to occur, she was granted a stay. Her punishment was next set for April 3, 2013. In late March, the Dallas County District Attorney announced that the date had been moved to June 26, 2013.
Are out of prison, and now that we have a vehicle to keep a person in prison for the balance of their lives, it just changes the equation. At one time had more people on death row than any other county in Texas. Time that a person goes to trial until that person is finally executed. There are a number of safeguards in the system. I think a lot of the issues concerning future dangerousness, I've had a lot of the appeals of capital cases. And that provides for a lot of expensive avenues to make sure that the conviction and death sentence is sound. It's stemmed around the fact of whether or not a person would be a danger in prison.
Finally, the day arrived. She was pronounced deceased at 6:37 p.m., 20 minutes after Texas prison officials began administering a single lethal dose of pentobarbital. In her final statement, McCarthy did not mention her status as the 500th inmate to be fatally punished or acknowledge Booth or her family. She said, "This is not a loss. This is a win. You know where I'm going. I'm going home to be with Jesus. Keep the faith. I love you all." She was looking toward her witnesses the whole time, who included her attorney, her spiritual advisor, and her ex-husband, new Black Panther Party founder Aaron Michaels. As the drugs started to take effect, McCarthy said, "God is great," before closing her eyes. She took hard, raspy, loud breaths for several seconds before becoming quiet. Then, her chest moved up and down for another minute before she stopped breathing. She is buried at Captain Joe Byrd Cemetery, the main prison cemetery in Texas. Number 2, Lisa Ann Coleman. Lisa Ann Coleman was convicted and fatally punished by the state of Texas in 2014. Coleman was sentenced for her role in the slaying of a 9-year-old boy named Devontae Williams, who was the son of her girlfriend, Marcella Williams. The slaying took place in 2004, when Coleman and Marcella Williams were living together in Texas. According to court records, Coleman physically harmed Devontae on multiple occasions, and the boy was found deceased in their apartment in July of that year. Coleman was convicted of the capital slaying in 2006 and sentenced. Her appeals were unsuccessful, and she was punished by lethal injection on September 17, 2014. Coleman spent her final days on the row at the Mountain View Unit Prison in Gatesville, Texas.
That's how her day has gone so far. She has had an opportunity to make some phone calls if she wants to some other people, and so she's had a chance to visit with relatives, spiritual advisor, attorneys today.
In the days leading up to her punishment, Coleman's legal team made a number of last-ditch appeals in the courts in an effort to delay or overturn her sentence. They argued that her trial had been marred by serious flaws and that new evidence had come to light that could exonerate her. Despite these efforts, Coleman's appeals were rejected by the courts, and her punishment went ahead as scheduled. In the hours leading up to her punishment, Coleman was visited by a number of family members and supporters, including her spiritual advisor, Reverend Carol Pickett. According to Pickett, Coleman was very peaceful in the hours leading up to her demise. He said that they spent time in prayer and reflection, and that Coleman was focused on the message of forgiveness and on making peace with those she had wronged. In her final statement, Coleman apologized to the family of Devontae Williams and expressed regret for her role in his passing. She said, "I never wanted to cause you pain. I hope that one day you can forgive me." Number 1, Lisa Montgomery. Lisa Montgomery, the only female inmate on federal end row in the U.S. at the time, was fatally punished for a slaying. She received a lethal injection at a prison in Terre Haute, Indiana, after a last-minute stay of punishment was lifted by the U.S. Supreme Court. The punishment was postponed twice, first by COVID-19, then by a judge, until a Supreme Court ruling cleared the way for it to take place. In a dramatic move late, a judge in Indiana had halted the scheduled injection until a mental competency hearing could be held. Her lawyers argued that she had been born brain damaged and was too mentally ill to be punished this way. As a child, she was routinely physically exploited by her father and trafficked by her mother, family members said. Her treatment was so violent that it amounted to torture, her lawyers say. Her defense team believes that at the time of her crime, Montgomery was psychotic and out of touch with reality. That opinion is supported by 41 current and former lawyers, as well as human rights groups like the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. But her victim's family and friends say the slaying committed by Montgomery was so horrific that she deserves to be put out, regardless of her mental health. The 52-year-old strangled a pregnant woman before cutting out and kidnapping her baby in Missouri in 2004. Her victim, 23-year-old Bobby Jo Stinnett, fatally bled, but her baby was safely recovered and returned to her family. Montgomery was the first female federal inmate to be put to her end by the U.S. government in 67 years. According to witnesses, a woman standing next to Montgomery during the process removed the inmate's face mask and asked her if she had any last words.
We will never forget the members of the law enforcement who found Bobby Jo's murder in less than 24 hours.
The crime is so vile, so shocking, and it was premeditated.
Victoria Jo is very beautiful, looks a lot like her mother.
And returned Victoria Jo safely to us. And loving wife, daughter, and sister, and would have been a wonderful mother. This case has finally come to a close, but we will never stop missing Bobby Jo. She was a sweet.
Talking, very intelligently talking.
There's no doubt about that. And so I think it's an appropriate verdict. And there's no doubt Lisa Montgomery killed Bobby Jo Stinnett.
Montgomery responded no and said nothing else. She was pronounced deceased soon after. Montgomery's lawyer, Kelly Henry, said that everyone who had participated in the passing should feel shame. She said, "The government stopped at nothing in its zeal to destroy this damaged and delusional woman. Lisa Montgomery's punishment was far from justice." Lisa spent the last days of her life inside a prison cell, hallucinating her vicious mother's voice, suffering nightmares of the physical torture she had endured, and drifting away in a house in her mind, just as she did while trying to survive being physically exploited as a young teenager. That's all for today's video. See you next time.